Hello and welcome. Welcome to the third episode in the series um, that we started this 3 weeks ago. People, place, and performance. It's a conversation from artists and researchers and practitioners from the continent of Africa to the global world. So thank you for joining us. My name is Taiwo Afolabi. I am the curator, the creator and the host of the series. I'm dialing in today from Regina in Saskatchewan. It's the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, the homeland of the Mischief Nations, where the Center for Socially Engaged Theater at the University of Regina is located. I really appreciate the opportunity to be doing this. So special thanks to HowlRound for creating the space and the platform to be doing this important work. I also want to thank the Center for Sustainable Practices in the Arts, CSPA, and Theater M3 International, our theater company partner, who have all come together to partner with us on this work. In our first episode, myself and playwright and theater maker Aliyah Kassam did an extensive exploration into the subject of this entire series. Aliyah and I really asked questions around what sustainability within the context of Africa. What does that even mean, especially when we're as artists and researchers, particularly as artists? And then last week, we explored eco-theater, looking at decolonizing the colonized narratives. Maya Ugutu and Kofi, we engaged and really looked into what does decolonization mean and what are those practices that are there already, and both of them shared from their work and the work of other people in terms of the practices that they are engaging in the work across various theater spaces, performance spaces, and all of that. Today, I have the privilege of engaging in dialogue with Adam and Harriet, and both of them are going to be introducing themselves. It's really a great opportunity to be able to speak to not just only artists, but also scholars and researchers who are situated both in the industry, in the theater sector, and also situated in the university. And a lot of the time, this is really key in terms of, and we're going to be hearing from them how their work and the work that they're doing, how that is influencing their own conversation around issues of climate change, planetary crisis, and climate justice. I want to say thank you to Flor Gomez. She's the coordinator and the glue that bring all of us together. So deeply appreciate the opportunity to be working with her. And thanks to our ASL interpreters, Victor and Tanya, and of course the captioner. So in case you need all of these accessibility resources, please would encourage that you put those functions on your Zoom interface. Without further ado, I'd like to quickly just call on Adam, and then from Adam, we'll pass it on to Harriet. You want to introduce yourself? Over to you, Adam.
Hi, thank you, Taiwo. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. So my name is Adam Marple. I'm calling in from Atlanta, Georgia today, but normally I am in Cairo, Egypt, where I'm the assistant professor of directing at the American University in Cairo. I am also the co-artistic director of the Theater of Others, which is an international theater company with members on every continent. creating work both online and in person, and continually trying to discover what that means to make the sustainable theater such an ephemeral art form that we have. But I'm also the leader of a project called the Sustainable Theater Network, which is a project that was built out of COP27 that happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt last year, and going into COP28, which is in Dubai, UAE this year. And it's a network of theater schools and institutions that are exploring how to not only research and create information around sustainable theater making, but also codify that and sustain that moving forward and share that with the industry. There's some amazing resources that have been shared and created, such as the Theater Green Book, Sustainable Theater Toolkit, and they're phenomenal. They're exhaustive, the resources are vast, and they're being translated in many languages around the world. I just got off of a call with them talking about translating this into Arabic. And like I said before, they're amazing, but they are built for national theaters. They're built for spaces that have the resources, both monetarily and physical resources to do that. And it's leaving young theater makers out on how to create these things. So we saw a place where we thought that we could kind of fit in to be a place where a young theater maker can come to find locally from wherever they are in the world, their own resources to create their work, making work that makes sense for their home countries. And then to share that, if possible, either coming to COP28 in December of 23 this year, or to stream as a best case scenario on our website, sustainable-theater.org. And finding that there are a lot of people out there who are wanting to do this, and they think that they're all alone out there doing this, when there's a very large community really working on this. So I'm really excited to be here and share what I can from what I have understood and what I've continuing to learn while being in Egypt. So thank you, Taiwo.
Thank you, Adam. And hopefully we can connect more about some of these amazing things that you're doing. It's really love to be part of that in some shape or form. Over to you, Harriet.
Yes, thank you very much. Please, can you hear me? I'm not so sure if I'm being heard.
Yes.
Yes, great. So I'd also like to say a big thank you for this opportunity to share the very little that I have experienced and I know about sustainability. And my name is Maoblom Harriet Ablajaho, and I'm connecting from Ghana, the University of Cape Coast. And so basically I am a theater practitioner, but I sort of major in set designing. And for me personally, I have always thought that the theater has so much power to change, the entire society, but we usually sort of only concentrate on the dialogue, particularly in the region in which I find myself. We only concentrate on the dialogue as having so much advocacy. But I think that every aspect of the theater also has that power available to them to change a whole lot of narratives surrounding us, particularly when we talk about waste material, how we manage it, how we create it, and how we go about reusing, recycling, and all that. And so I thought of actually implementing or sort of advocating for the use of plastic waste. In Ghana here, plastic waste is a big problem for us. Everywhere you turn, there are heaps and heaps and heaps of plastic waste. And I just thought, how best can I use it in the area in which I find myself? And so I thought of converting that waste into material for building the set. And so I'm also here to just share my few experiences with you and also learn from all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet. We're going to talk about what your initiative, because I think that, of course, I am from Nigeria. So when you talk about waste and waste management and how can we repurpose some of those waste into something more meaningful, I'm game with you. So thank you for that. I did mention earlier on that in the first episode, Aliyah and I talked about environmental theater and climate justice in Africa. And one of the things we talked about is that we have to consider this holistically. So not just in the realm of dialogue alone, we have to think about design. We have to think about music. We have to think about every component of the theater making process. under eco theater, decolonizing the colonized narrative, we also talked about the practices of even creating the stories themselves. Like, what are those narratives that we have been fed, all right, we've developed, we've grown with, and that has sort of created a gap where we don't even take a look at our own practices, whether as a community, as a region, and all of that. So today, in the next 50 minutes or so, Adam and Harriet and myself, we're going to be really exploring the idea of retooling green tool for theater in Africa. Insights from practitioners, and like both of them said, they're going to be diving into some of the case studies, the work that you're doing, and we'll see what come out of that for us. What I normally do at the beginning of each episode is to give a shout out to communities or initiatives or artists that are doing amazing work on the continent, and of course globally. So not just only just the continent of Africa. And today I'd like to just and we're off, hopefully folks that we've all heard, this is not a new information, and if it's new, that's also great. I want to give a shout out to Climate Change Theater Action today. It's really a neat initiative that has been ongoing for since 2015. And the whole idea of Climate Change Theater Action is really a worldwide festival of plays about the climate crisis presented perennially, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, to coincide with the United Nations COP meetings. And so they feature 50 plays across the world. And I think that it's just each year we see the plays and we see artists across the world that have been part of these initiatives. It just blows our mind to see the level of creativity and thinking and giving visibility to works across the continent, particularly that focuses on climate crisis. And so really great shout out to that initiative. It was originally conceived by Elaine Avila, Chantal Belideau, Roberta Levito, and Caridad Swish. I hope I pronounced those names correctly. And then of course it's following a model pioneered by No Passport Theater Alliance, and anybody that is interested can just go online to read more about them. climatechangetheateraction.com. all of that detail is there. And of course it has a lot of partners, and really excited that one of the partners obviously is the Center for Sustainable Practice Within the Art, CSPA, who is also partnering with us on this series. Anyway, that's the initiative I'd like to just give a shout out to today. And if anybody knows any playwrights in your region that are really engaging with some of these topics, and you want to connect them to this initiative, please feel free. I believe that every year is an opportunity to really give that platform for playwrights to be able to present their work. So anyway, shout out to that. Adam is going to give us do a quick excerpt from a piece that they will be there. I think maybe they've had interaction with over for a while. So I'll pass it on to Adam, and then after that we'll get into our dialogue. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Taiwo. Thank you for indulging me for this, but I think it's a really it's a beautiful piece, and it's a piece that is important for part of this conversation, so that we don't creep out of theater land into purely academic exercise. We have to continuously bring this always back to theater. This is a piece called A Brave and Startling Truth by African-American poet laureate Maya Angelou. And she created this piece for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations founding. And this is a piece that inspired us, and we used in our production that we took of The Earth Turns to COP27 last year, and has inspired this year's performance as well. And so when we think about the struggles and the fights that we've had in the 20th century. As an American myself, the social justice movement, civil rights movement, obviously is very large. And from that, there's a known worldwide anthem for social justice: "We shall overcome." And it's been sung in the apartheid South Africa. It's been sung in Ireland during the Troubles. It was sung during the summer 2020 after George Floyd. It is something that we can all get behind and sing and do. And what we don't have for climate justice is an anthem for that either. We don't have something that we can sing, get behind, and everybody get with. And so I've been proposing this poem for a while, and while it may not catch on, I think it really is inspiring. So I wanted to start with this today. This is what ended our production and what we left the audience with. We, this people, on a small and lonely planet, traveling through casual space, past aloof stars, across the way of indifferent suns to a designation where all signs tell us it is possible and imperative that we learn a brave and startling truth. And when we come to it, to the day of peacemaking, when we release our fingers from fists of hostility and allow the pure air to cool our palms, when we come to it, when the curtain falls on the minstrel show of hate and faces sooted with scorn are scrubbed clean, when battlefields and coliseum no longer rake our unique and particular sons and daughters up with bruised and bloody grass to lie in identical plots in foreign soil, when the rapacious storming of the churches, the screaming racket in the temples have ceased, when the pennants are waving gaily, when the banners of the world tremble stoutly in the good, clean breeze, when we come to it, when we let the rifles fall from our shoulders and children dress their dolls in flags of truce, when landmines of death have been removed and the aged can walk into evenings of peace, when religious ritual is not perfumed by the incense of burning flesh and childhood dreams are not kicked awake by nightmares of abuse. When we come to it, then we will confess that not the pyramids with their stones set in mysterious perfection, nor the gardens of Babylon hanging as eternal beauty in our collective memory, not the Grand Canyon kindled into delicious color by Western sunsets, nor the Danube flowing its blue soul into Europe, not the sacred peak of Mount Fuji stretching to the rising sun, neither Father Amazon nor Mother Mississippi, who, without favor, nurture all creatures in the depths and on the shores. These are not the only wonders of the world. When we come to it, we, this people, on this minuscule and kithless globe who reach daily for the bomb, the blade, and the dagger, yet who petition in the dark for tokens of peace, we, this people on this mote of matter in whose mouths abide cankerous words which challenge our very existence, yet out of those same mouths come songs of such exquisite sweetness that the heart falters in its labor and the body is quieted into all. We, this people on this small and drifting planet, whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living, yet those same hands can touch with such healing, irresistible tenderness, that the haughty neck is happy to bow and the proud back is glad to bend. Out of such chaos, of such contradiction, we learn that we are neither devils nor divines. When we come to it, we, this people, on this wayward floating body created on this earth, of this earth, have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where every man and every woman can live freely without sanctimonious piety, without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible. We are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it.
Thanks, Adam. I'm familiar with the poem. When I was thinking about the connection to what we're doing here, and I think something that Maya Angelou reminds me of in that poem is my responsibility and your responsibility. That we as the people, there's nothing that is going to help us except we help ourselves, which brings me to the topic of today, because it's very practical. Harriet was talking earlier on about the initiative that, she's trying to bring about in Ghana. So I wanted to start with a question to both of you. How are you reimagining, the idea of greening theater in your work? And I hope you can speak from the perspective of your work on the continent, because a lot of the time when we hear piece around green tool and all that, first thing first, we think about the Western world. It's always about, something AI somewhere and all that. How are you reimagining that in your own work? And perhaps how are others also around you reimagining that, the idea of greening the theater within the context of your work on the continent? So Adam, and then we'll pass it on to Harriet.
Oh, no, please, Harriet. Yeah, I'd really love to hear what you're saying, because I'm a director, and I'm coming from a director's perspective, which is quite interesting in that it's normally led by designers, and it should be.
Yes.
But directors need to be cognizant of this as well, because if they're leading the project, the buck stops somewhere. But I would really love to hear, Harriet, where you're starting from.
Thank you. Harriet, over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for referring to the set designer first, because in the theater, when we go on to the hierarchy, it's always a director that has a final say. So thank you for the honors. And at least from the experience that I had over a couple of years with the sort of how do I even call it? Innovation, I would call it an innovation that I'm trying to embark on, is to look at it from the point of our very own indigenous form of arts. So we know that in Africa, this is no news, that we had our own form of performance even before we had this, westernized form of theater. We had what we called the storytelling, if we should put a tag on it. And this storytelling was sort of a morality performance where people are critiqued and lifestyles are judged and corrected. And if there is anything that is happening in the community that is not in line with what, and before I even move on to then, we believe that it is not just us human beings existing in this world, but then we have the man, we have deities, we have gods, so that even before you cross a river or you go fetch water from a river, there has to be some kind of rituals that you perform. You don't just walk into any river at all, particularly on some certain days, or even go into any forest at all to cut any kind of tree and then use for whatever it is that you want to use it for. But then before you cut certain trees, there has to be a prayer that is said. Other than that, there can be some very serious consequences that either you, the individual, or your family, or the entire community could face just by cutting a certain tree that you are not supposed to cut. And so I thought that if we say we are greening, most of the times, like you rightly said, we look at the Western world. What are they developing? It is that is how we judge ourselves. That is the standard for whatever it is that we are doing. Because of course, whatever we are doing is from them. So if we want to do it as well as they are doing it, then we might as well just look at what they are doing and try to match up to it. But I thought perhaps if I look back at those things that we used to have, and gradually they are beginning to fade away because of the power of academia and, training people in certain principles. If I should embark on that journey, would that be fruitful? And I would say that I was able to achieve that. And I used the storytelling, indigenous performing arts. Usually it is performed in an open space. It could be in someone's courtyard. It could be just open doors it's usually performed in a found space. But contrary to theater is done in an enclosed space on a proscenium stage. Well, that is what we have been taught, or otherwise. And so if I want to replicate this storytelling session outside of the theater, then I am recreating an entire environment where buildings, then there are trees, there is someone's clothes hanging somewhere. This is the entire recreation. But if I should do it neatly, then I would have to rely on fresh materials or material sourced from the environment. And that was one thing that I was trying to prevent. So then why don't I just depend on the waste materials, the plastics? At first, I opened up, the resources to cover every kind of waste material, the biodegradable, the non-biodegradable. And so I considered glass, there's plastic, there's PVC pipes, all kinds of waste to build or recreate this storytelling session. And believe you me, after I had built the set, so I used, maybe in another session, I'll talk about that into details, but just replicating that entire thing in an open space where you don't need tickets. So whether you can afford it or not, everyone has the opportunity to interact with that material, and then for them to actually think about the kind of things that they can also use the waste materials for, not just for theater purposes, but also for any other thing at all. And so when I think about greening the theater, I look beyond the box where theater performance is just for the stage, and actually move into the community, into the society, where people cannot afford to buy theater tickets to come and listen to you talking about climate change, but then they can freely experience the kind of change that we would want to have in a society. And I have always thought that we have something valuable in our own indigenous culture of storytelling, where it's not just the performer to the audience, and we have that divide, but the performer and the audience are both performers. And so you talk, I talk. If you have a question and you want to intercept during the performance, you can do that at any time. And we have a dialogue, a full dialogue. There's no divide between the performer and then the audience, but it's more participatory, where someone even has an addition to make. You are allowed to do that. And so that is where I take my greening from, that there is no divide in society-wise, that there is no creation of that sort of divide. So that's how I would say.
Well, thanks, Harriet. Thank you for kind of setting us on that path in terms of your own philosophical and ideological grounding of where you're coming from when it comes to greening, both from a content standpoint and from a design standpoint. We're going to come to design in our next round of questioning. Adam, I'll pass it on to you now as the director, like you rightly said, and thanks for the for giving the space to Harriet, because I mean, this is not a space to talk about hierarchy and directing and all of that, but it clearly also shown the kind of value that you uphold in your space, which absolutely, for me, it's really critical to our conversation from a holistic standpoint. Anyway, I'll pass it on to you now.
No, and I really appreciate that, because I was taking notes while Harry was saying that, because it really inspired me to kind of talk about this. Because I think, I know your last episode was about decolonizing the theater, but I think it's incredibly important, because I think the reason we are in the position we are in now, having to actually fight for and explain to people why theater should be sustainable, is a colonial problem. It's a problem of space, and it's a problem of narrative and genre. We conflate theater, ER, the building, with theater, RE, the act. And so therefore theater RE has to take place inside of theater ER, the building. And that's not the case at all. Theater can happen anywhere. We know this intellectually, but very rarely do we actually practice it. The other thing that is a colonial narrative that has stayed over is realism, naturalism. Theater has become dominated by realism and naturalism. And when you do realism and naturalism, you need stuff, because that's what is real. That is what is natural. But theater is not its best when it's realistic and it's naturalistic. It's best when it's expressionistic. It's best when it's symbolic. It's best when it is coming out of ritual. So I know, in the United States, there are strikes going on with the actors and, with the production companies and film and things like that. But that's where naturalism and realism probably works best and should stay. And theater should be doing something different. We've lost that battle with film and television. Let's not do that anymore. Let's do what theater does best, which is exactly what Harry was talking about, which is that blurred line of where the performer and the audience interact. And once we've kind of got those problems put away, or we're no longer worried about those problems, then we can actually talk about sustainable theater in a way that is not confusing for audience makers or policymakers or funders, because then theater is not trying to be television or film. And why are we making things less aesthetically pleasing in that respect? So I really appreciate that. From my perspective, you know, I grew up in the 80s and we had this phrase, reduce, reuse, recycle. And I think we all kind of understand that recycling is not living up to what we were all promised it was going to do. So I've taken recycle out of that when I'm making my work, and I do reduce, reuse, refuse. And I think that refuse part is an incredibly important part, because I think we as theater makers want to, obviously spectacle is a part of our art. And so we want it to be as beautiful and big and gorgeous as possible. And we can conflate spectacle with stuff, with needing money, needing things. And I'm much more of a minimalist. I really am. My spaces, I like the actors to be preeminent in the space, and then whatever little design elements are necessary become really focused, and then you can really appreciate that. So it's something that I have done my entire life, but it really was fast forwarded when I moved to Egypt. I want to tell just a really tiny story about one of my productions of where I've gotten to today, because I was driving south in Egypt, and Egypt is on the eastern side is kind of the Red Sea is there, and then the desert is to the west. So you're kind of in between these two places. And as I'm driving down and the sun is coming up, I'm looking out into the desert, and it's sparkling. It's gorgeous, just like little diamonds in the desert. And I thought, how beautiful that is. But as the sun came up, I realized they weren't diamonds, they were plastic bags. Because Egypt is all desert and it's just wind being blown from wherever, all of everything is just getting blown into the desert and becomes a giant trash heap. And I thought, oh my God, I can't, it hurt, you know, it hurts to see that kind of thing, because the desert is gorgeous, it's beautiful. And when I got back from my vacation, I was working on a production, and I said, look, we've got to, like Harriet was doing, we have to use the waste. We have to use the things that are around us. We have plenty of plastic. Let's see if we can make this beautiful. And I say this not to shame the gentlemen who were doing this, but it was literally a form of ignorance, just not knowing how to do that. I said, we're going to use plastic to create this set. And I come in the next day, and they had bought cases of water, and they were pouring the water out and using the plastic bottles for plastic. Again, it's not malicious. It was just literally, oh, he said, let's use plastic. I know where we can get some plastic, instead of the rethinking of that thing. And so a lot of times you're doing a double duty as a director, right? You're setting the goal, like, here's where we're going to go. As Harry said, like, usually the director is the end all and be all, and I don't want that to be the case. But I do have to point in a direction of where we're going to go. And if I say we're going to make it sustainable, unless people know what that means, then we will start dumping out plastic water bottles for plastic sets, versus also having to somewhat educate. And if you have, you know, brilliant designers who can be on that track with you, and that education can go from the production side to the performer side to, if you're a university institution, to trickle all the way down, then it starts to build up. And if you don't have to be in a space, and you don't have to make narrative theater naturalistic, and then you no longer are confused by what sustainable theater can be, then we can start to see actual changes happening from the ground up and from the top down.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's both of you are sort of really pulling on this idea of a sustainable theater practice, not just only, and I love the distinction of it as a building and of course the act itself. And my own theater company, when I started in Nigeria, of course, because of the economic situation, there are times that it forces you to think outside the box, like Harriet was saying. You don't have capital, because the question of capital also, Adam, is really critical. We always think it's about getting money to do more. But when you're in a place where resources is sort of limited, there are ways you start thinking in a minimalist way. Also, for me, I'm an applied theater practitioner. So that means I go to community to do a lot of work. And so you don't even think about how many gadgets, how many sets. It's like, this is where in this market space right now, this is our set. Let's do it, right? Which is really interesting, really, really interesting to see where the thinking around resources, the thinking around the presentation mode, whether realism, naturalism, expressionism, and all of that really changes the dynamics and speaks to the ideas and the ideologies of what our theater is really built on. And I'm going to connect that to Harriet. I really want Harriet to speak more specifically to that, to how you went about really your work on using the plastic to create the kind of theater that you wanted.
Yes.
If you could speak more to that.
All right. So we all know, starting every venture is not an easy thing. And particularly when I was thinking about this thing, it was during the COVID period. And so just the thought about using the waste materials from people who could possibly be carrying the virus, it was quite challenging for me. And so how I started it was to actually contact some few trusted people who could, instead of always burning, that's our culture here. We either just throw them at the dump site or we burn them in a small corner somewhere. So instead of throwing them away, they should just pack all the plastics, excluding the ones that contain particles of food, because I didn't know how quickly I was going to experiment with the materials. Perhaps you add some food items and then I open it up and I'm quite, I don't know, I have some things for some worms. And so I just didn't want to experience that. And so I realized that just depending on those people wasn't moving the work as fast as I wanted. So I had to overcome my fear of having to interact with people who may have been exposed to the virus. So I contacted these few eateries around, and there were some hotels that were still in operation, to just the bottles and then the other kinds of plastics that they would otherwise throw away. And then I'll just pick and then wash. So initially, like I said earlier on, I opened the resources to all the varieties. And I realized that it's being an exploratory, research that I was doing with very little, I wouldn't even say very little. I had no kind of technology to assist me. So everything I was doing was really manual. In fact, initially, I didn't even know how to put them together. And so I went online to see how other peoples were experimenting with plastics. And I chanced on someone who had actually built a school using plastic bottles. And I was very much impressed. An entire school, of course. There had to be an introduction of a new materials just for reinforcement. Otherwise, the plastic alone would be very light, to hold the entire structure. And I thought that was very inspirational. And instead of replicating it directly, I also thought about how to make it suitable for the theater. So I went on a spree of testing and experimenting. I would shred them and try to melt them together. And a lot of the testings that I did, I always had to remind myself of the question, is it sustainable? Sustainable, not just in the sense of minimizing on the funds that you would need for construction, but also on the environment itself. That was my main concern, because withdrawing the plastics from the environment and then introducing new forms of materials into the atmosphere sort of, it raises a lot of question as to whether you are robbing Peter to pay Paul. You are just shrouding your whole experiment in sustainability, but when we go deeper into it, it actually isn't sustainable. So a lot of the experiments that I had done that I thought would have worked better for the construction and easier in the long run didn't prove to be sustainable, because one, in melting the plastics, I was introducing toxic materials, toxic gases into the atmosphere. And one, for myself, in the process of, I had to stir, like I said, it was a manual exercise. So while melting it, I had to stir, and mistakenly, I went over the can and I nearly suffocated just by inhaling that small amount of smoke. And I could just imagine all this while I was burning this thing, and this thing is just going into the air. The amount of harm I am causing all those within my environment and then beyond. And so then I had to rethink. I visited the table many times before finally settling on, of course, one thing I also realized from the whole exercise is that it is quite challenging to have a 100% sustainable venture. I don't know, for me, I think it is impractical to have something 100%. You say this is outright clean. Definitely, there will be some waste that will be generated, but the concern has to be with the amount of waste that you are generating while trying to recycle the waste. And so I had to resort to, how do I describe this? Sorry, just while I'm trying to put my thoughts together. So I had to resort to building a cylinder of the bottles. I settled on using two kinds of plastics. So the usual water bottle, drinking bottles, and the ones that contained the soda drinks. And then here in Ghana, I don't know about Adam, we have this sachet rubbers in which we have water instead of always having the water bottles, and those are far cheaper than buying the water bottles. And so, and that is a major concern here in Ghana, the sachet, because it is very cheap. Everyone is able to afford it, unlike the water bottles. And so I used the sachet, I cut them open and then ironed them together. I put, and whatever material I used were all waste. So even the calendar that I use, because it's a soft plastic, if I should apply direct heat to it, it would melt easily. So I had to put an old calendar over the soft plastics and iron the edges together. And I had this huge sheet. I created the sheets in the measurements of, well, they were varying, but the biggest was 12 feet by 6. So the height was 12 and then the length was 6 feet. That was the biggest I had and it was a lot of work to do, because cutting the sachet rubbers up, I had to wait for them to dry because they had water in them before ironing them together. And this sheet was what I used to create the walls of the compound within which the storytelling session is going on. And then I used the plastic bottles, the water, the drinking bottles and all that, to create cylinders, cones, pushing one bottle on top of the other, and then using old ropes. It could be either from jute sacks. I tore jute sacks up, or old ropes found somewhere. And then I passed it through these cylinders just for reinforcement, because of course it is something very light. And so me thinking that I could do this thing entirely of plastics, at the long run, I thought it was just a big joke. I was just, ew. It was quite funny. And then at the point I realized there was no way I could do away with introducing new materials. I was trying very hard to minimize as much as possible on the use of wood, because that has been a concern in Ghana, deforestation. people illegally felling trees. And then we have this issue of illegal mining. And for them, they don't care about whatever trees are there. They just grade the entire space just for mining purposes. And so for these two things, the illegal felling of trees and then the illegal mining, is causing degradation to be on a faster rate here in Ghana. And I thought that instead of theater also depending on the forest for its resources, we could also do something just to send a message to these people who don't regard the forest as something that is valuable, to also know that it is, and we have to preserve it for the future. We came to meet it, and so we must leave something for the coming generation. And so in using the plastic bottles for for building the house in which, you know, the narrator, you know, interacts with people within the compound from, I still had to use wood, but I minimized it by 1/3. So in my normal design works, if I should go with the wood, this time around, I cut it down into 3, and then I used just 1/3 of the fresh materials from the forest, which is the wood. And so these woods were used as a frame for reinforcing the plastic cones that I had sort of created. And so the ropes that I had initially passed through these cylinders had to go through the frames, just so when because I was putting the how do I call it? The production was going to happen in the open space. I had no protection against, you know, natural elements. It was open to wind. And in fact, on the day after I had finished building, I don't know what happened. There was just a strong wind from somewhere, just carried half of the set that I had constructed, and in fact it's broke about half of them into pieces, and I had to reconstruct again. And so I was just thinking that if I hadn't used the wood, then perhaps the plastics would have been flying somewhere, and I would have to be running after them, you know, just to bring it back and recreate. And so I think that yes, there has always been that question of 100% sustainability in you know, whatever thing that we would want to do. So that is from my experience with my project.
Well, thank you, Harriet, for sort of, I know that we have, you know, time is really limited, but you've taken us through, I'm just having the mental picture of the process itself, because really you had to get your hands dirty. It's really interesting. Adam, because I think that part of the things you said earlier on, and I knew you're going to respond to the question on ground, but bringing back the piece of reduce, even though, and I'm hearing that in what Harriet is saying, is that, you know, she worked to reduce the introduction of new materials, even though it has to be introduced, but the idea of that reduce became very critical. And I'll pass it on to you, Adam, to speak to the question on the ground.
Yeah, no, I think we're never going to get to 100%. And I think we can't chastise ourselves for not getting to 100%. That's never going to help us out. I mean, if nothing else, if we're never going to get to 100%, because how did the audience get here? That has to be factored into it as well, which we're never going to be able to take care of that. And a lot of us cannot do theater without air conditioning either. That can't be gotten rid of. I mean, so we're never going to get to 100%. It's not about getting rid of it. It's about reducing. It really is about being conscious about making choices. So many times we just accept. It's always been done this way. This is how I will continue to do it, versus going, right, but does that actually make sense for us? Does that fit monetarily? Does that fit aesthetically? Does that fit dramaturgically? Does that fit pedagogically? Because wood is the same thing, the same scenario here in Egypt as well. I was stunned that the majority of sets are still using wood in a country where there is no forest. So all wood is having to be imported from somewhere else, versus going, why? You are such amazing builders of stone. Why are you importing wood to make productions? Because it's a colonial mindset that's been borrowed from the British when they were doing theater there. It's the same thing, but it's never about asking the question, why are we doing this? Does this make sense? Are there other ways of doing this? when I did my production for the COP, I was thinking mostly about electricity. We have so much sun in Egypt. Obviously, there's just days and days of sun. And I thought, why isn't everything solar powered? Why aren't we doing everything in our power to really kind of harness that? And so I started looking at lighting. I was really focusing on lighting because I knew we were going to be traveling, so I didn't want to have too much of a set to build. So I started thinking about solar power arrays, and I also thought about bicycle human-powered batteries for these LED lights. And what I found, which was mind-boggling for me, was that a typical proscenium theater uses somewhere between 180,000 to 300,000 watts of electricity to light a 2-hour show. And again, it goes back to that thing of this is an ephemeral art, and what footprint are we leaving behind every single time to do this thing that will not exist in any other way, shape, or form, but in the memory of the audience. So it is that thing of, I'm never going to be able to get rid of it, but what can I do to reduce the harm that I'm going to have for something that's going to be nothing but, neurons connecting with each other down the road? The play will exist in their mind. So what do I need to do to implant that idea, that memory, that thought? I don't need electricity. I don't need steel. I don't need, what's the bare necessities to tell this story that we do so well? Can we just be outside? Can we put a rug on the ground, and will people, come and circle around us like they naturally do? Theater, there we go. Anything beyond that is icing on the cake, in my opinion.
Thanks so much, Adam. I know we have 8 more minutes. If there's any question, our listeners and viewers can pass it on. I would, 2 things. One is, from what both of you are saying, there's this idea around thinking globally but acting locally, because the resources available, or the issues, that the challenges we're facing, across the border are different. For Ghana, it's different, and the opportunities also. It's not just only challenges, but those challenges bring opportunities. In Egypt, it's different, and in other spaces, it's different. The second one I wanted us to talk about, hopefully we have time, is the idea of measuring the carbon footprint. I know there are a lot of tools out there, well, some tools, not a lot, that are measuring carbon footprint. Do we have anything like that? Do both of you know if there is, or we have in whatever shape or form like that on the continent, not necessarily designed from the West to us, but do we have our own way of measuring our green, our carbon footprint, and the impact of our greening initiatives? And any of you can go. Adam, maybe based on the work that you're doing with COP and other global initiatives. Harriet, maybe also for you, some of your own work or others. Again, and if we don't have the answer, it's also fine. We don't have to.
I will say, yes, there are tools to do that, but I'm not entirely sure they're helpful for us. Okay. Because again, these tools have been designed for nations, for corporations, for industry, and the standards for those versus where we are and what we do. It's one of those things where I had a conversation with my father the other day, and he was talking about how John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, is having to fly around the world to meet with leaders about reducing emissions and whatnot. And he said, how hypocritical. And I said, versus what? Versus nothing? Yes, of course it's hypocritical. He could not fly around the world and do those things, but you can't compare one thing. It's apples and oranges, right?
That's right.
The national standard of emissions versus what a local theater company is doing, they cannot be judged on those same things. So I don't know that these carbon footprint counters are helpful for our industry. We will never reduce to zero, and we will never even come close to what they're asking for us to do.
Harriet?
Yes, for my side, I don't know about any tool of that sort, but I have read somewhere that all trees have varying, rates of its own carbon emissions, as well as all the other things that we do. And so that is what I take into cognizance. If I'm using any material at all, I try to research on it to see what kind of carbon footprint or what kind of emission am I creating? What kind of gases am I introducing into the atmosphere? But for the particular tool in measuring, our carbon footprint, particularly in theater, I haven't come across that yet.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. There's no question coming my way yet. We only have 5 more minutes, but it's really fascinating how in your different spaces you are thinking locally and also acting personally. Because a lot of the time we think, oh, let's think globally, act locally, but the personal element then goes back to Adam, the poem that you set us off with, where Maya Angelou is saying we as people, we have to take responsibility. And I think I'm hoping that this episode, that's the first piece that hopefully we can take away, is that on the continent, that artists, practitioners, designers, scenographers, and every person within the ecosystem, that in many ways they are thinking of ways of around climate issues when it comes to creating, designing work. The second thing also I want to highlight is that question, and I think that in our last episode, Kofi did give us that question as an offering, one of our guests, that we have to start asking ourselves question, why are things the way they are, right? Rather than taking it just like hook, line, and sinker. And Adam, you did refer to that also. The fact that, sets have been built by wood, when in Egypt, for example, this, it's history, it's the citadel of beautiful, sculpture with stone built like pyramids. You're like, nobody can beat that in the world, in my own naive opinion, right? And so why can't we play to our strength? Why are we always playing to the narrative of the other? So that's the second thing. But I think that also brings us to the bigger question around the narratives that we've been fed with, that we grew up with, that theater has to be this certain thing, when really, what our own idea, how have we been practicing that, and what do we need to start doing to be able to untangle ourselves from those colonial narratives, from those sort of, it's a grip that we have been put into, and we need to really take ourselves out of that, really. Anyways, are there any last thoughts? There's no question coming my way, so I take it that there are no questions from our audience. But Adam and Harriet, any last thoughts that you want to share with us before we call it a day today? We always want to respect the time, so we'll pass it on to Harriet.
Yes.
And then to Adam.
Yes, so I'll just take it from what Adam said in the poem, or the poem by Maya Angelou, that it is from me and it is also from you. We all have to come together to work to make this thing work. One thing that I experienced from my experiments was people's concern that it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. And so why would I want to rely on waste materials when I can use fresh wood and then get cleaner and finer designs? But I know where I'm coming from, and I know the sort of environment I'm living in, and I wouldn't want to raise my children in that kind of environment. And so we have to always take the time and reflect on our own actions, not just the benefits that we attain today, but then we think about how that is going to affect those who come after us. And then we think about the benefits that we'll just earn now. So that's what I would say.
That's beautiful. And that's exactly where I wanted to take it as well. It's like, we need to start thinking of ourselves as ancestors. We need to start thinking, I mean, we're so much thinking about the past and where we are right now as descendants, and that's fantastic, but we need to start thinking about ourselves as ancestors for the generations that are coming and what we are leaving them. And I think that is an important part of what the COP is trying to do. But beyond that, at the same time, I know the series and HowlRound is so devoted to theater makers and people interested in theater. Every single one of us is an audience member as well. And as an audience member, we can start having these conversations on our own. We don't need to be led by a director We don't need to be led by sustainability managers. We as an audience can start having these conversations on our own and start demanding and asking for these changes to happen. If you are interested in it, let people know that you're interested in it. Otherwise, they probably won't start doing it because it seems like it's hard and it's difficult and it's expensive. But when everybody starts demanding that it's going to happen, they will start doing it, because whether we want to or not, we will have to do this because the planet is heading toward the apocalypse. So I don't want to leave it on a bad note like that, but I wanted to leave it on that hopeful note of going, think back to your grandparents and your great-grandparents and what they have left you and how much different it is and how much progress has been made. And think about yourself as a great-grandparent and what you hope your descendants are going to be left with if you leave it for them and if you make those changes now.
Thank you so much. We're the future ancestors. We're the ancestors, and we have to think that way. Which is really important. And the other thing also is, you know, Adam, it's that sense of agency that audience think they don't have, that really they do have. If audience choose not to come to a show that is ecologically unfriendly, that has not put sustainability at the heart of it, if they choose not to come, that show is going to fail. So I think that, so you're not leaving us on the note of doom and, you know, and all that and gloom. You're leaving us on the note of hope that audience need to know the power, the agency that they have, and they need to take that. With that, well, I'd like to say thank you to both of you for coming. It's always great for me to just sit down and have this conversation and really also meet people and hear the amazing thing that is happening. And so thank you once again. Thank you to HowlRound, to CSPA, and of course to Flo that has been helping us, and to CSET and to Tedemshu International, and then to our ASL interpreters, Tanya and Victor, and of course to our captioner, AJ. Well, we will see everybody again next week, Wednesday, same time, for the fourth edition, the fourth episode. So on my end, I'm signing out. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you may be. Bye.